The Blackwood Forest had always been off-limits to the children of Millbrook, but Tommy Chen wasn't like other 8-year-olds. While his classmates played video games, he studied old maps and folklore, obsessed with the town's dark history that adults refused to discuss. When fresh blood drops appeared on his doorstep that October morning, leading directly into the woods, every instinct told him to follow. Tommy had been awake since dawn, sketching the strange symbols he'd found carved into the old cemetery gates. His grandmother's journal, hidden beneath loose floorboards in her attic, contained references to these same markings. She'd written about the binding and the guardian's sacrifice in her spidery handwriting, but the entries stopped abruptly in 1952, the year she'd died under mysterious circumstances. The blood drops were still wet, crimson pearls catching the early morning light. They led from his front porch across the yellowing grass, over the cracked sidewalk, and straight toward the forest's edge. Tommy grabbed his backpack, stuffed with a flashlight, his grandmother's journal, and a thermos of hot chocolate his mother had prepared for his nature walk. If she knew where he was really going, she'd lock him in his room for a week. The warning signs began 50 yards from the tree line. Danger, unstable ground, private property, no trespassing, wildlife preserve, authorized personnel only. Tommy had memorized them all during his previous scouting missions, though he'd never been brave enough to venture past the rusted fence that marked the forest's true boundary. Today felt different. The blood trail pulsed like a beacon, each drop perfectly spaced, as if something had been walking slowly, deliberately, marking a path for him to find. The fence had a hole just large enough for a small boy to squeeze through. Tommy had discovered it weeks ago while mapping the perimeter. Blackberry thorns caught at his jacket as he crawled through, leaving tiny scratches on his hands that reminded him uncomfortably of the blood he was following. Inside the forest, the air grew thick and cold. Ancient oaks towered overhead, their branches interwoven so densely that only scattered shafts of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. The blood trail continued, leading deeper along what might once have been a path, but was now barely a deer track winding between moss-covered stones. Tommy's phone lost signal within minutes, just as he'd expected. He'd researched the phenomenon online. Locals called it the dead zone, blaming it on mineral deposits or underground caves. But Tommy suspected something more deliberate was at work. The further he walked, the more the forest seemed to watch him. Branches creaked without wind. Shadows moved in his peripheral vision. Once, he could have sworn he heard whispering, but when he stopped to listen, only silence pressed against his ears. After an hour of walking, the blood trail led to a clearing dominated by the largest oak tree Tommy had ever seen. Its trunk was easily 20 feet across, its roots spreading like gnarled fingers across the forest floor, and there, bound against the ancient bark by chains that seemed to grow from the tree itself, was something that made Tommy's breath catch in his throat. The figure appeared to be a young man, perhaps 20, with pale skin that seemed to glow faintly in the filtered sunlight. His clothes were old-fashioned, a white shirt and dark vest that belonged to another century. But it was his face that held Tommy transfixed, sharp cheekbones, dark hair that fell across his forehead, and eyes that burned with an amber light no human possessed. When the creature's gaze found him, Tommy felt pinned like a butterfly to a board. "You shouldn't be here, boy," the figure said, his voice carrying an accent Tommy couldn't place and a weariness that seemed to echo from the depths of time itself. "The chains that bind me also protect this town from something far worse than vampires." Tommy's hand instinctively went to his grandmother's journal. In her notes, she'd written about the guardian bound by willing sacrifice and the price paid in blood and years. He'd thought it was fantasy, the ramblings of an old woman fascinated by local legends. Apparently, he'd been wrong. The vampire's eyes followed his movement. "Ah," he whispered, and something like recognition flickered across his pale features. "You carry her scent. Margaret Chen's grandson, aren't you?" She was the last to know the truth. Tommy found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a squeak. "My grandmother died when my mom was little. She died keeping my secret," the vampire corrected gently, "as her grandmother did before her, and hers before that. Your family has been the keepers of this knowledge for generations." That's when Tommy noticed what made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The massive chains that held the vampire were covered in hairline cracks, spider webbing across the ancient metal like a windshield about to shatter, and with each word the creature spoke, the cracks seemed to spread a little further. The blood trail grew thicker as Tommy ventured deeper into Blackwood Forest, each crimson droplet catching what little moonlight filtered through the twisted canopy above. His small sneakers squelched in the damp earth, and he pulled his jacket tighter against the unnatural chill that seemed to seep from the very trees themselves. Every rational part of his 8-year-old mind screamed at him to turn back, to run home to the safety of his warm bed and forget he'd ever seen anything unusual. But curiosity had always been Tommy's greatest weakness, or perhaps his greatest strength. His mother often said he was too brave for his own good, and tonight those words felt more prophetic than ever. The trees around him were ancient, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers that seemed to grasp at his clothes as he passed. Strange sounds echoed through the darkness, the crack of twigs, the whisper of wind through leaves that sounded almost like voices, and something else, a low, rhythmic sound that might have been breathing. Tommy paused, his heart hammering against his ribs. The blood trail led to a clearing just ahead, where pale moonlight illuminated what appeared to be the ruins of an old stone structure. Moss and ivy had claimed most of it, but he could make out the remnants of walls and what might once have been an altar or table at its center. That's where he saw him. A man, if he could be called that, knelt beside the stone structure, his back turned to Tommy. He wore clothes that seemed to belong to another century, a long, dark coat with tarnished silver buttons and boots that had seen decades of wear. His hair was black as the forest shadows and fell to his shoulders in waves that moved despite the absence of any breeze. Tommy's breath caught in his throat. He should have run then, should have listened to every instinct telling him that he was in the presence of something fundamentally wrong. Instead, he found himself stepping closer, a twig snapping under his foot. The man's head turned with an unnatural fluidity, and Tommy found himself staring into eyes that glowed like amber embers in the darkness. The face was pale as moonlight, sharp-featured and beautiful in the way that predators are beautiful, all clean lines and dangerous grace. When the man smiled, Tommy glimpsed teeth that were too white, too sharp. "Well, well," the man said, his voice carrying an accent that Tommy couldn't place, something old and foreign. "What have we here?" "A little lamb who has wandered far from his flock." Tommy wanted to speak, wanted to explain himself, but his voice seemed frozen in his throat. The man rose to his full height, easily 6 feet tall, and Tommy noticed that his movements held that same unnatural grace, as if he were floating rather than walking. "You followed the trail, didn't you, child?" The man gestured to the blood droplets that had led Tommy here. "Clever boy. Most children would have turned back at the forest's edge, but not you." He tilted his head, studying Tommy with those burning eyes. "You have the sight, don't you? You see things others cannot." Finally, Tommy found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Who are you? What is this place?" The man laughed, a sound like silk being torn. "My name is Constantine Dracul, and I am the keeper of this place. This," he gestured to the ruined structure, "is all that remains of the binding circle built by your ancestors 3 centuries ago. And you, little one, are standing at the heart of magic older than your great-grandmother's bones." Tommy's eyes darted around the clearing, taking in details he'd missed before. Symbols were carved into the remaining stones, strange markings that seemed to shift and writhe when he looked at them directly. The ground within the circle was barren, nothing growing there despite the lush forest surrounding it. "I don't understand," Tommy said, his voice growing steadier despite his fear. "What kind of magic?" Constantine stepped closer, and Tommy caught a scent like old leather and winter nights. "The kind that keeps monsters at bay, child. The kind that has protected your little town of Millbrook for 300 years. His smile turned sad, almost wistful. "Though I fear that protection is beginning to weaken." As if to emphasize his words, a sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the forest, a howl that was neither fully human nor animal, filled with a hunger that made Tommy's skin crawl. "They know," Constantine murmured, his eyes scanning the tree line. "The binding grows weak, and they can sense it. Soon they will test the barriers again." He looked down at Tommy, and for a moment his expression was almost gentle. "You should not have come here, young one. This place is not meant for innocent eyes." But even as he spoke the words, Tommy sensed that Constantine was not entirely displeased by his presence. There was something calculating in those amber eyes, as if the vampire, for Tommy somehow knew that's what he was already forming plans that involved an 8-year-old boy who had followed a blood trail into the heart of darkness. Tommy's small fingers trembled as he pushed aside the thorny brambles, following the crimson trail deeper into Blackwood Forest. The blood drops had grown larger, more frequent, painting fallen leaves like scattered rubies in the dim afternoon light. His mother's warnings echoed in his mind. "Never go past the old stone wall, Tommy. Never venture where the trees grow thick and the shadows dance." But curiosity pulled him forward like an invisible thread. The forest seemed to breathe around him. Ancient oaks twisted skyward, their gnarled branches forming a canopy so dense that daylight barely penetrated the gloom. Moss hung like tattered curtains from the limbs, and somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed its lonely warning. Tommy clutched his wooden sword tighter, the toy weapon offering little comfort against the growing darkness. The blood trail led to a clearing where time seemed suspended. In the center stood a massive oak, its trunk so wide that 20 men holding hands couldn't encircle it. Its bark was black as midnight, scarred with deep grooves that looked disturbingly like claw marks. At its base, heavy iron chains snaked around the trunk, disappearing into the earth on either side. The metal links were thick as Tommy's wrist, green with age and rust, yet somehow still gleaming with an inner light that hurt to look at directly. Tommy approached slowly, his sneakers crunching on dead leaves. The blood trail ended here, pooling around the base of the tree before seeping into the dark soil, but there was no wounded animal, no source for the crimson path he'd followed. Just the tree, the chains, and a silence so complete it pressed against his eardrums. "Hello, little one." Tommy spun around, his wooden sword raised defensively. Behind him stood a man, or what appeared to be a man, tall and gaunt with pale skin that seemed to glow in the forest twilight. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, and his clothes looked like something from the old history books at school, a long black coat, fitted trousers, and boots that made no sound on the forest floor. But it was his eyes that made Tommy's breath catch. They were the color of fresh blood, and ancient beyond measure. "You shouldn't be here," the stranger said, his voice carrying a strange accent that Tommy couldn't place. "This place is forbidden for good reason." I followed the blood," Tommy stammered, backing toward the chained tree. "Something was hurt. I wanted to help." A smile played at the corners of the man's mouth, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white. How noble, and how foolish. That blood wasn't from any wounded creature, boy. It was bait. Bait? For the curious, for the brave, for children who don't listen to their mother's warnings. The stranger stepped closer, and Tommy noticed he cast no shadow, despite the dappled light filtering through the leaves. "Tell me, what do you know of your town's history? Of why Millbrook has prospered when other settlements have withered and died?" Tommy pressed his back against the iron chains, feeling their cold bite through his thin jacket. "My dad says it's because we work hard and because we help each other." Noble sentiments. The man's laugh was like wind through a graveyard, but incomplete. "Your town thrives because of what sleeps beneath these chains, because of the bargain struck 3 centuries ago by your ancestors." "What bargain?" The stranger's eyes flicked to the massive tree, and for a moment something like pain crossed his features. They were desperate, you see. Plague had come to the valley, crops failed, children died in their mother's arms, and in their desperation they sought out old magic. Dark magic. Tommy's grip tightened on his wooden sword. "You're lying." "Am I?" The man knelt, bringing himself to Tommy's eye level. This close, the boy could see that his skin wasn't just pale, it was translucent, with dark veins visible beneath like a roadmap of shadows. Touch the chains, little one. Feel how warm they are despite the cold. Feel how they pulse like a heartbeat. Despite himself, Tommy's free hand moved toward the iron links. The moment his fingers made contact, images flooded his mind. He saw men and women in pilgrim clothing, their faces gaunt with desperation. He saw them gathering in this very clearing under a blood-red moon. He saw them binding something to this tree, something with glowing red eyes and fangs like ivory daggers, something that screamed as the chains wrapped around it, sealing it to the ancient oak. Tommy jerked his hand away, gasping. "Now you begin to understand," the stranger whispered. "They bound me here as payment for their prosperity, made me guardian of their curse, keeper of their shame. For 300 years I've watched over Millbrook, ensuring their crops grow tall and their children grow strong. But every bargain has its price." "The blood," Tommy whispered, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "You need the blood." The vampire's smile was terrible and sad. "Very good, little one, very good indeed." The vampire's pale hand gestured toward the deeper shadows of the forest, where twisted branches formed a natural archway draped in moss. Tommy's sneakers squelched against the damp earth as he followed, his heart hammering so loudly he was certain every creature in Blackwood could hear it. The blood trail had long since disappeared, absorbed into the hungry soil, but the metallic scent lingered in the air like a promise of violence. "What's your name, boy?" The vampire's voice drifted back to him, soft as falling leaves. "Tommy Hartwell." His voice cracked on the second word. "What's yours?" A low chuckle echoed through the trees. "I have had many names across the centuries, but you may call me Matthias." He paused beside a massive oak whose trunk bore deep claw marks. "Tell me, Tommy Hartwell, what do you know of your town's history?" Tommy wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "Not much. Mom says it was founded a long time ago by settlers or something." "Settlers." Matthias traced one of the claw marks with a finger that ended in what might have been a nail or might have been a talon. Such a simple word for such complex people. "They came here fleeing something, Tommy, something that hunted them across an ocean and through primeval forests until they found this place." The trees seemed to lean inward as they walked, creating a living tunnel that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. Strange flowers bloomed in the perpetual twilight, flowers Tommy had never seen before, with petals the color of dried blood and centers that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. What were they running from? Tommy asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know. Matthias stopped walking. In the dim light, his pale skin seemed to glow faintly, and when he turned to face Tommy, his eyes held depths that belonged to something far older than his youthful appearance suggested. "The same thing that stalks the edges of your dreams, child. The same shadows that make you check under your bed and behind your closet door. The difference is that what they fled was real, and it was hungry, and it would not stop until every last one of them was dead." A wind rose from nowhere, stirring the leaves overhead with a sound like whispered warnings. Tommy pulled his jacket tighter around his thin frame. "But they got away, right? They came here and were safe?" "Safety." Matthias resumed walking, his feet making no sound on the forest floor. Such a fragile concept. They thought the ocean would stop their pursuer. They thought distance would save them. But some hungers transcend geography, and some predators view obstacles merely as inconveniences. They emerged into a circular clearing where the canopy opened to reveal the first stars of evening. At the center stood a ring of standing stones, each one carved with symbols that hurt Tommy's eyes to look at directly. The air here felt thick, electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. "So it followed them?" Tommy's voice was barely a whisper. "Oh, yes." Matthias moved to the largest stone, where the carved symbols seemed to writhe and shift in the starlight. It followed them across the sea, through the wilderness, drawn by the scent of their fear and the warmth of their blood. When it finally found them, they had already begun to build their settlement. They had planted crops, raised children, dared to hope for normal lives. Tommy approached the stone circle cautiously. The symbols made his head ache, but he couldn't look away. They seemed to tell a story, figures running, pursued by a shape that defied easy description, something with too many teeth and not enough humanity. What did they do? Matthias placed his hand flat against the central stone. The symbols flared briefly with cold blue light. They made a choice that would echo through generations. They summoned something to protect them, something almost as dangerous as what they fled. They bound it with blood and desperation, and the kind of bargains that leave stains on souls. They summoned you? Not exactly. Matthias's smile was sad and sharp. They summoned something older, something that required a guardian to keep it contained. I volunteered for that honor, thinking it would be temporary. That was 347 years ago. Tommy's legs suddenly felt weak. He sat heavily on the mossy ground at the edge of the stone circle. So you're protecting the town from this thing they summoned? Among other things, yes. Matthias moved around the circle, checking each stone like a doctor examining a patient. The binding holds, but it weakens with time. Each generation the chains grow a little more brittle. And lately, he paused at a stone where one of the carved symbols had begun to crack. Lately, something has been testing those chains very deliberately. The forest fell silent around them, as if every creature was holding its breath. In that silence, Tommy could swear he heard something else, a rhythmic sound like massive claws scraping against stone. Deep beneath their feet, something was stirring. Tommy's sneakers squelched against the forest floor as he followed the crimson trail deeper into Blackwood's embrace. The blood had darkened from bright red to rust brown, but the droplets remained distinct enough to track. Each step took him further from the safety of Mill Creek's borders, where streetlights and familiar voices couldn't reach him. The trees seemed to lean inward as he progressed, their gnarled branches forming a canopy so thick that even the afternoon sun struggled to penetrate. Tommy pulled his jacket tighter, though the chill creeping up his spine had little to do with temperature. His grandmother's warnings echoed in his memory, but curiosity proved stronger than fear. A low moan drifted through the shadows ahead. Tommy froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound came again, definitely human, definitely in pain. He crept forward, placing each foot carefully to avoid snapping the brittle twigs scattered across the ground. The blood trail led toward a massive oak tree, its trunk easily wide enough for 3 grown men to hide behind. As he rounded the ancient giant, Tommy gasped. A man lay crumpled against the oak's roots, his clothes torn and stained with blood that matched the trail Tommy had followed. But something was wrong with the picture. The stranger's skin held an unnatural pallor, almost translucent in the dim light. His dark hair fell across a face that seemed both young and impossibly old, as if time couldn't quite decide what to do with him. The man's eyes snapped open, fixing on Tommy with an intensity that made the boy stumble backward. Those eyes were the color of winter storms, gray with flecks of silver that seemed to move like living things. "You shouldn't be here, child." The stranger's voice carried an accent Tommy couldn't place, each word carefully formed as if the man was remembering how to speak. "This place, it's dangerous for the innocent." Tommy found his voice, though it came out smaller than he'd intended. "You're hurt. The blood. I followed it to find you." A bitter smile crossed the stranger's lips. "How very like them you are. Always wanting to help." He struggled to sit up straighter, wincing as he moved. "What's your name, brave little hero?" "Tommy Hartwell." The words tumbled out before Tommy could consider whether giving his name to a wounded stranger in the forbidden forest was wise. "Are you from Mill Creek?" "I don't recognize you." The man studied Tommy's face with those unsettling eyes. "Hartwell," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the name. "Yes, I can see it now. You have her nose. Margaret Hartwell was your ancestor, wasn't she? Several generations back?" Tommy blinked in surprise. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I knew Margaret." The stranger's smile turned sad. She was the last one who understood what keeps this town safe, the last one who knew why certain boundaries must never be crossed. A chill ran down Tommy's spine that had nothing to do with the forest's shadows. That's impossible. My great-great-grandmother Margaret died like 50 years ago. Try closer to 150. The man pushed himself fully upright, moving with fluid grace despite his obvious injuries. Time moves differently when you're not entirely human anymore, young Hartwell. Tommy took several steps backward, his mind reeling. You're crazy. People don't live that long. People don't. The stranger's eyes began to glow faintly in the dim light. But I gave up being people a very long time ago. As if to punctuate his words, the man's lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth that were definitely not human. Two elongated canines caught what little light filtered through the trees, gleaming white as bone. Tommy's breath caught in his throat. Every monster movie he'd ever watched, every whispered story shared during sleepovers, suddenly felt very real. You're a vampire. Among other things, the creature, because Tommy could no longer think of him as merely a man, rose to his feet with supernatural grace. My name is Lucian Ashworth, and I am indeed what your kind call a vampire. But before you run screaming back to your safe little houses, you should know that I'm probably the only reason your safe little houses still exist. Tommy's legs felt like water, but he managed to stay upright. What do you mean? Lucian gestured to the dark forest around them. This place is a prison, child, has been for over 2 centuries, and I am both its warden and its most dangerous inmate. His expression grew grave. Your ancestors understood the bargain. They knew what lurked beneath Mill Creek, and they knew what it cost to keep it contained. What lurks beneath? Something that makes vampires look like bedtime stories. Lucian's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Something that your people accidentally awakened long ago, and something that I've been holding back ever since. But I'm growing weak, young Hartwell. The bindings are failing. Tommy's mouth went dry. Bindings? The very foundations of your town are built on a supernatural prison. Every house, every street, every happy little life, all of it sits atop a cage that's beginning to crack. The ancient vampire's words hung in the air like morning mist, chilling and inescapable. Tommy pressed his back against the cold stone wall of the crypt, his heart hammering so loudly he was certain Malachar could hear it. The creature's pale eyes seemed to glow in the dim light filtering through the forest canopy above. A guardian? Tommy's voice came out as barely a whisper. But you're a monster. Malachar's laugh was like autumn leaves scraping across a tombstone. Monster? Perhaps. But even monsters can serve a purpose, little one. He moved with fluid grace, circling Tommy like a predator, yet keeping his distance. Tell me, child, have you ever wondered why your quaint little town of Millbrook has never suffered the plagues that befell its neighbors? Why the crops never fail completely? Why the storms always pass you by? Tommy shook his head, too frightened to speak. Because I have kept vigil for 300 years, Malachar continued, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. Bound by chains forged in blood and sacrifice, I guard against something far worse than myself. The vampire gestured toward the deeper shadows of the crypt, where Tommy could make out the shapes of iron restraints embedded in the stone wall. They were massive, clearly meant for something much larger than a man. Dark stains covered the metal links, and strange symbols were carved into each link. What? What's worse than a vampire? Tommy asked, surprised by his own boldness. Malachar's expression grew grave. Have you heard the old stories, boy, the ones your grandmother whispers when she thinks no one is listening, about the devourer that once stalked these lands, consuming entire villages in a single night? Tommy nodded slowly. Grandma Elsie had indeed told such stories, usually dismissed by his parents as folklore meant to keep children from wandering into dangerous places, stories of a creature that fed not just on blood or flesh, but on the very essence of life itself, leaving behind nothing but withered husks and barren earth. Those stories are true, Malachar said. The devourer was my master long ago. I was its herald, its hunting hound. Together, we laid waste to countless settlements across the old world. His voice carried genuine remorse. But power such as that, it corrupts even the corrupt. The devourer grew mad with hunger, threatened to consume everything until nothing remained but a dead world. The vampire paused before a section of the wall where the chains were thickest. Tommy noticed that fresh blood had been splattered across them recently, the blood he'd followed through the forest. A coven of witches, the last survivors of the devourer's rampage, managed to bind it here, Malakar continued. But the binding required a guardian, someone who understood the creature's nature, someone who could maintain the seals with regular offerings. He held up his hands, and Tommy saw the fresh cuts across his palms. My blood, freely given, keeps the prison strong. But why? Tommy stepped closer, drawn in despite his fear. Why would you choose to guard it? Why not just let someone else do it? Malakar turned to face him fully, and for a moment, Tommy saw something unexpected in those ancient eyes, pain. Because, little one, some sins can only be atoned for through eternal vigilance. I helped create this monster. It is my burden to ensure it never again sees the light of day. A low rumble echoed from somewhere beneath their feet, and the temperature in the crypt dropped noticeably. The iron chains rattled, and Tommy could swear he heard something like breathing coming from deep underground. It knows you're here, Malakar said urgently. Your youth, your innocence, such things call to it like a beacon. You must leave now. But Tommy found himself rooted to the spot, staring at a section of the stone floor where cracks had begun to appear. A faint, sickly, sweet smell wafted up from below, making his stomach churn. The binding grows weaker each year, Malakar admitted. I am not immortal, despite appearances. Eventually, I will fade, and then... He didn't finish the sentence. What happens then? Tommy whispered. Then your peaceful little town becomes the first course in a feast that will not end until the world is nothing but dust and shadow. The rumbling grew louder, and more cracks appeared in the floor. Tommy could see a faint greenish light emanating from the fissures, pulsing like a heartbeat. Go, Malakar commanded, his fangs extending as his face contorted with effort. He pressed his bleeding hands against the chains, muttering words in a language that hurt Tommy's ears to hear. Run back to your family, your safe little life, and forget you ever found this place. But even as Tommy turned to flee, he knew he couldn't forget. The image of those chains, the sound of something vast and hungry stirring beneath the earth, was already burned into his memory forever. The ancient vampire's words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Tommy's heart hammered against his ribs as he stared at the creature before him, trying to reconcile the horror stories he'd heard with this being who claimed to protect his town. I don't understand, Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive silence of the forest clearing. If you're protecting us, why is everyone so scared of this place? Valdris moved with fluid grace to a moss-covered stone that jutted from the earth like a broken tooth. He settled upon it, his pale fingers tracing ancient symbols carved into its surface. Fear serves a purpose, child. It keeps people away from things that could destroy them. His crimson eyes fixed on Tommy with an intensity that made the boy's skin crawl. Your town sits upon a convergence of old magic, a place where the barriers between worlds grow thin. Beneath your streets, beneath your homes, something sleeps that must never wake. Tommy took a tentative step closer, fascination warring with terror. What kind of something? A hunger that devoured entire civilizations before your ancestors learned to write their names in the dirt. Valdris's voice carried the weight of centuries. The sleeper came from the spaces between stars, drawn by the warmth of living souls. It fed until nothing remained but empty husks and silent cities. The forest around them seemed to lean in, listening to the vampire's tale. Tommy noticed how the trees here were different from those at the forest's edge, twisted and gnarled, their bark bearing scars that looked almost like claw marks. How did they stop it? Tommy asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Valdris smiled, revealing those needle-sharp fangs. They didn't stop it, boy. They contained it. 7 bloodline families, practitioners of the old ways, performed a binding ritual that cost them everything. They wove their very life forces into chains of blood and bone, creating a prison that would hold the sleeper until the end of days. Tommy's mind raced. But if they're all dead, who maintains the prison now? Clever child. The vampire's laugh was like wind through a graveyard. The families didn't simply die, they transformed. 7 guardians, 7 eternal sentinels to watch over the binding. I am the last. The revelation hit Tommy like a physical blow. The others are gone? Destroyed, one by one, over the centuries. Some fell to hunters who didn't understand what they were protecting. Others succumbed to madness. Eternity is a heavy burden, for minds not meant to bear it. Valdris stood, his form seeming to blur at the edges, and one chose to break his oath. What happened when he broke it? The chains began to weaken. Each guardian lost weakens the binding exponentially. With only my power maintaining the prison, the sleeper stirs. It dreams, and in dreaming, it reaches out. The vampire gestured toward the twisted trees. This forest is closest to the convergence point. The sleeper's influence seeps through the cracks in its prison, changing everything it touches. Tommy thought of the blood trail that had led him here, of his sister's strange behavior, of the whispers he'd been hearing at night. Is it already getting out? Not yet, but soon. Valdris moved closer, and Tommy caught the scent of old earth and copper pennies. The binding requires a blood sacrifice every 100 years, not death, but a willing soul to reinforce the chains. I have performed this duty 6 times, but I grow weak. My essence frays like an old rope. What happens if you can't do it anymore? Then the sleeper wakes, and everything within 1,000 miles becomes its feeding ground. The vampire's eyes bored into Tommy's. Your family, your friends, every living thing you've ever known, all of it consumed to feed an appetite that spans millennia. Tommy felt sick. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on him like a physical thing. Why are you telling me this? I'm just a kid. Because, young Thomas, you are not just anything. Valdris knelt before him, bringing their faces level. You walked through my protective barriers as if they were morning mist. You found me when no living soul has managed such a feat in over 2 centuries. There is something in your blood, something that calls to the old magic. I don't want to be special, Tommy said, tears threatening to spill down his cheeks. I just want to go home. Home is what we're trying to save. The vampire placed a cold hand on Tommy's shoulder. But first you must understand the full scope of what we face. The blood you followed here tonight, it belongs to someone the sleeper has touched. Someone in your town is becoming its herald, preparing the way for its awakening. Tommy's blood turned to ice. Who? Valdris's expression grew grave. Someone close to you, child. Someone you trust. The sleeper always chooses its heralds from those who can do the most damage to the bonds that hold it. The vampire's words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. Tommy pressed himself against the cold stone wall of the chamber, his heart hammering so loud he was certain Marcus could hear it, echoing through the ancient space. You don't understand, Marcus continued, his pale fingers tracing the intricate symbols carved into the altar. This curse isn't just some old wives' tale. It's a binding, woven into the very foundation of your town. Every brick, every beam, every soul that calls Millbrook home. All protected by the darkness I've carried for 3 centuries. Tommy's voice came out as a whisper. Protected from what? Marcus turned, his silver eyes reflecting the flickering torchlight. From them, the devourers, creatures that make vampires look like house cats. He moved with fluid grace to a section of the wall where more symbols were etched deep into the stone. Your ancestors summoned something they couldn't control, Tommy, something hungry, something that would have consumed every living thing for miles if not for the barrier. The boy's mind raced, trying to process the impossibility of it all. But if you're protecting us, why are people afraid of the forest? Why do people disappear? A shadow crossed Marcus's features. Because the barrier requires maintenance, blood freely given, willingly sacrificed. For centuries, I've sustained it myself, but I'm weakening. The binding grows thin. He gestured to the altar, where Tommy now noticed dark stains that looked disturbingly fresh. Sometimes, someone wanders too deep into the woods. Sometimes, the forest calls to them. I try to turn them away, but if they persist, Tommy's stomach churned. You kill them. I preserve them, Marcus corrected sharply. Their essence becomes part of the barrier. A few lives lost to save thousands. It's not a choice I make lightly. The torches flickered, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. Tommy noticed movement in the darkness beyond the chamber, shapes that shifted and writhed just out of sight. His breath misted in the suddenly frigid air. They're close tonight, Marcus murmured, following Tommy's gaze. Closer than they've been in decades. Can you feel it? The wrongness pressing against the edges of your world? Tommy could feel it. A crawling sensation under his skin, like insects made of ice. The shadows beyond the chamber seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and somewhere in the distance he heard a sound that might have been wind through trees or might have been screaming. Why are you telling me this? Tommy asked, backing toward what he hoped was the tunnel entrance. Why not just do whatever you did to the others? Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Because you're different, child. You found me when you shouldn't have been able to. You followed blood that wasn't there for others to see. You've walked through wards that should have turned you around a dozen times over. His eyes narrowed. Tell me, Tommy, have you always seen things others couldn't? Heard whispers in empty rooms? Felt drawn to places you shouldn't go? The questions hit too close to home. Tommy thought of the voices he sometimes heard calling his name when he was alone, the shadows that moved wrong in his peripheral vision, the way certain places made his skin crawl for no reason he could explain. I don't know what you're talking about, he lied. Of course you don't. Marcus stepped closer, and Tommy caught a glimpse of fangs. But your blood knows. Your blood sings with the same power that created this curse. You're descended from them, aren't you? The original casters, the fools who opened the door and couldn't close it. The chamber suddenly felt much smaller. Tommy's back hit the wall, and he realized with growing panic that he couldn't remember which tunnel he'd come from. They all looked the same now, dark mouths leading to unknowable depths. I want to go home, Tommy said, hating how small his voice sounded. Home? Marcus tilted his head. But don't you understand? This is why you came here. Not by accident, not by coincidence. The curse is failing, Tommy. Soon the barrier will fall completely, and when it does, he gestured to the writhing shadows, well, Millbrook will become a very different place. The sounds from the darkness grew louder, definitely not wind now, definitely screaming. Tommy's hands shook as he pressed himself flatter against the stone. But there's another way, Marcus continued conversationally. A willing descendant. Blood given freely with full knowledge of the choice. It would strengthen the barrier for another century at least, maybe longer. Tommy's blood turned to ice water as understanding dawned. You want me to? I want you to save your town, Marcus said softly, just like your ancestors should have done 300 years ago. The question is, are you brave enough to finish what they started? The ancient oak's hollow felt smaller now, pressing against Tommy's shoulders as he crouched beside Matthias. The vampire's skin had taken on a waxy pallor, and dark veins spider-webbed across his face like cracks in old porcelain. Each breath came as a wheeze, and Tommy could smell something sour and metallic in the air. The binding is breaking faster than I anticipated, Matthias whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that had begun to howl through the forest. The chains that hold the darkness, they're connected to my life force. As I weaken, so do they. Tommy's small hands trembled as he pulled his jacket tighter. What happens when they break completely? A distant sound echoed through the trees, a low, mournful howl that seemed to come from deep underground. Tommy felt the hair on his arms stand up. Was that them? One of them, testing the boundaries. Matthias struggled to sit up straighter, his fangs gleaming in the dim light filtering through the tree's opening. They know I'm dying. They can smell my weakness like wolves scenting wounded prey. The howl came again, closer this time, joined by another from a different direction. Tommy pressed himself against the back of the hollow, his heart hammering so hard he was sure it would give away their location. "Tell me about the ritual," Tommy whispered urgently, "the one that bound them in the first place." Matthias closed his eyes, his breathing becoming more labored. It was 1692. The Devourers had already consumed 3 villages to the north. A coven of witches, led by a woman named Evangeline Thorne, discovered they could use the life essence of a willing guardian to create unbreakable chains. But the guardian had to be something that could survive indefinitely. Something already touched by death but not claimed by it. "A vampire," Tommy said, understanding dawning. "I volunteered, though I didn't fully comprehend what it would mean. Evangeline warned me that the binding would tie my existence to the prison itself. As long as I lived, they would remain trapped. But if I died—" He trailed off as another howl split the air, this one so close that dirt rained down from the tree's ceiling. Tommy peered out through a gap in the hollow's wall and saw shapes moving between the trees, tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their movements were wrong somehow, too fluid, as if they were made of liquid shadow rather than flesh and bone. "They're getting closer," he breathed. "The barriers are failing." Matthias gripped Tommy's wrist with surprising strength. "Listen to me carefully. There is a way to reinforce the binding, but it requires a blood sacrifice from someone pure of heart, someone who truly understands what they're protecting." Tommy's stomach dropped. "You mean me?" "Not your life," Matthias said quickly. "Just a few drops, willingly given, combined with the right incantation. It would buy us time, perhaps months, maybe a year. But Tommy—" The vampire's grip tightened. "Once you become part of the binding, you'll be connected to this place forever. You'll feel every time the Devourers test their prison. You'll know when the darkness grows stronger. And when I finally die, the responsibility will fall to you." One of the shadow figures passed directly in front of their hiding place, its head swiveling toward the hollow. Tommy held his breath, watching as the creature's face came into view, or what passed for a face. It was a void of absolute darkness with 2 pinpricks of hungry red light where eyes should be. When it opened its mouth, Tommy saw rows of needle-sharp teeth and felt a cold so intense it seemed to freeze the air in his lungs. The thing lingered for an eternal moment, its empty gaze seeming to penetrate the tree's bark. Then another howl sounded from deeper in the forest, and it glided away into the darkness. Tommy waited until he couldn't see any more of the creatures before turning back to Matthias. The vampire looked even worse than before, his skin now almost translucent. "What do I have to do?" Tommy asked, surprising himself with the steadiness of his own voice. "You're certain?" Matthias searched the boy's face. "Once this is done, there's no going back. Your life will never be normal again." Tommy thought of his mother, probably pacing the kitchen floor right now, wondering where he was. He thought of his classmates, safely asleep in their beds, unaware that creatures of nightmare stalked just beyond the town's borders. He thought of Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store, and Mr. Johnson who always waved from his porch, and all the people who would die if the Devourers broke free. "I'm sure," he said. The ancient tome felt heavier than it should have as Tommy clutched it against his chest, following Valdris deeper into the heart of Blackwood Forest. The vampire moved with predatory grace between the gnarled trees, his pale form seeming to glide rather than walk across the moss-covered ground. Behind them, the sounds of the hunt grew louder, howls that didn't belong to any earthly wolf, and the thunderous crash of something massive breaking through the underbrush. "How much farther?" Tommy whispered, his breath coming in short gasps. The book's leather binding felt warm against his arms, as if something alive pulsed within its pages. "The ritual site lies ahead," Valdris replied without turning. "Where my brother first bound the darkness 3 centuries ago." His voice carried a tremor Tommy had never heard before, fear perhaps, or something deeper. But I must warn you, boy, what we attempt tonight, there are prices that must be paid. A bone-chilling shriek split the air behind them, close enough that Tommy could smell sulphur and decay on the wind. He stumbled over an exposed root, nearly dropping the tome. Valdris spun with inhuman speed, catching the book before it could hit the ground. "Careful," the vampire hissed, his red eyes blazing. "That book contains the only words that can strengthen the seal. Lose it, and your town dies tonight." They emerged into a clearing where ancient standing stones formed a perfect circle. Symbols carved deep into the granite pulsed with a sickly green light, and the air itself seemed to thrum with barely contained energy. In the center of the circle, the ground had been worn smooth by countless rituals, stained dark with what Tommy desperately hoped was just old earth. "This is it," Valdris breathed, reverently approaching the nearest stone. "Here," my brother Cassius bound himself to hold back the Shadowborn. "Here, he became both guardian and prisoner." Tommy felt the book grow warmer in his arms. The leather binding began to smoke slightly, and the metal clasps clicked open of their own accord. Pages fluttered in a wind that touched nothing else, settling on passages written in languages that predated human civilization. "I can't read this," Tommy said, panic creeping into his voice. The howling behind them grew closer, and he could see shapes moving between the trees, things that walked on too many legs, with eyes like burning coals. "You don't need to read it," Valdris said, placing his cold hand over Tommy's. "The words will come. The book chooses its reader, and it has chosen you." The vampire's expression softened for a moment. "You have courage, young Thomas, more than most men twice your age." A shadow detached itself from the tree line, and Tommy's blood turned to ice. The creature that emerged was impossibly tall, its limbs too long and jointed in ways that hurt to look at. Its face was a void punctuated by teeth that gleamed like broken glass, and when it spoke, the voice came from everywhere at once. "Brother," it said, the word dripping with centuries of hatred. "Have you brought me a sacrifice? How thoughtful." "Malakar." Valdris stepped between Tommy and the shadow creature, his own fangs extending. "You cannot enter the circle. The binding still holds." For now, Malakar laughed, a sound like breaking bones. "But I smell mortality within the sacred space. Innocent blood, the very thing needed to break dear Cassius's precious seal." More shapes emerged from the forest, creatures of claw and fang and writhing darkness. Tommy felt the book's pages turning faster now, the ancient words beginning to glow. Somehow, impossibly, he could understand fragments of the text, words of binding, of sacrifice, of prices willingly paid. His heart sank as the truth became clear. "The ritual requires a life," he whispered, looking up at Valdris. "Someone has to take Cassius's place." The vampire nodded grimly. "I had hoped there might be another way, but I'll do it," Tommy said quietly. "No." Valdris's refusal was immediate and fierce. "You are a child. You have a life to live, a future ahead of you." "And I won't have either if those things get loose," Tommy replied, surprising himself with his calm. "Besides, you said the book chose me. Maybe this is why." Malakar's laughter grew louder, and more shadow creatures poured into the clearing. They pressed against an invisible barrier at the circle's edge, their claws scraping against something that sparked and hissed. "Decide quickly, the shadow being taunted. My children grow hungry, and your barrier weakens with each passing moment." Tommy opened the book fully, and the pages blazed with silver light. The ancient words seemed to lift off the parchment, swirling around him like living things. He could feel their power, their hunger for completion. "Teach me the words," he said to Valdris. "Teach me how to save everyone." The vampire stared at him for a long moment, something like pride flickering in his crimson eyes. Then, with trembling hands, he began to turn the pages to the binding ritual. The abandoned mill loomed before them like a twisted monument to decay, its weathered wooden beams jutting into the sky like broken ribs. Tommy clutched the ancient key Elder Thorn had given him, its iron surface cold enough to burn his palm even through his gloves. Beside him, Marcus moved with the fluid grace of a predator, every step calculated and silent. "The binding chamber lies beneath," Marcus whispered, his pale eyes reflecting the moonlight filtering through the bare branches above. "But Tommy, you must understand, once we begin this ritual, there will be no turning back. The curse will demand a price, and it always collects." Tommy's breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as he nodded, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. The weight of his town's fate pressed down on his small shoulders like a boulder. Behind them, Millbrook lay in an unnatural silence, its streets empty save for the creatures that had begun emerging from the shadows, twisted things with too many teeth and eyes that glowed like dying coals. They approached the mill's entrance, where massive wooden doors hung askew on rusted hinges. The smell hit them first, a mixture of rot, ancient magic, and something else, something that made Tommy's stomach churn with recognition. It was the same metallic scent he'd followed into the forest days ago, the one that had started this nightmare. Marcus pressed his hand against the door, and it swung open with a groan that seemed to echo from the very foundations of the earth. Inside, broken machinery cast strange shadows in the pale light. Dust motes danced in the air like tiny spirits, and somewhere in the darkness, water dripped with the persistence of a funeral march. There, Marcus pointed to a section of the floor where the wooden planks formed a peculiar pattern, a spiral that seemed to draw the eye inward. "The key will reveal what has been hidden." Tommy approached the spiral, his hands shaking as he inserted the key into what appeared to be solid wood. The moment the iron touched the surface, the planks began to shift and separate, revealing a stone staircase that descended into absolute blackness. The air that rose from below carried with it whispers in languages that predated human civilization. They descended slowly, Tommy's flashlight beam dancing across walls carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The stairs seemed to go on forever, spiraling down through layers of earth and stone and something else, something that felt alive and watching. Marcus moved behind him, silent as death itself, and Tommy found himself wondering if bringing the vampire here had been the right choice after all. The staircase finally opened into a vast underground chamber, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. In the center stood a circle of 7 stone pillars, each one inscribed with chains of silver that glowed with an inner fire. Between the pillars, the air itself seemed to writhe and pulse, as if something enormous was trying to push through from another realm. "The threshold," Marcus breathed. And for the first time since Tommy had known him, the vampire sounded afraid. "I had hoped the stories were exaggerated, but this is far more powerful than I imagined." As they approached the circle, the temperature plummeted even further. Tommy's breath came in ragged gasps, not just from the cold, but from the oppressive weight of malevolent attention that seemed to focus on them. The shadows between the pillars began to take shape, tall, impossibly thin figures with faces that were holes in reality itself. "The Shadowkin," Marcus whispered. "They've been waiting here, held back only by the barrier. If that fails completely..." One of the creatures turned its non-face toward Tommy, and when it spoke, its voice was like the sound of graves opening. "Child of blood and bone," it hissed, the words seeming to come from inside Tommy's own skull. "You carry the key, but do you carry the will? The barrier weakens with each breath you take. Soon we will walk among the living once more, and the feast will be glorious." Tommy stepped closer to the circle, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to run. The key in his hand had grown so cold it was beginning to burn, but he held on. Around the chamber's walls he could see more symbols, more chains, all of them showing signs of age and wear. Some had already gone dark. "What do I have to do?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Marcus moved to stand beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "The ritual requires a guardian's blood to renew the binding. But Tommy, there's something else Elder Thorn didn't tell you. The Guardian doesn't just give blood, They give their life force, their years, their future. Each renewal ages the Guardian decades in moments. The Shadowkin pressed closer to the barrier, their forms becoming more solid, more real. In the distance, Tommy could hear something else approaching through the tunnels behind them. Heavy footsteps and the sound of claws scraping against stone. The ancient vampire's screams echoed through the cavern as golden light poured from the shattered crystal fragments. Tommy stumbled backward, his small hands still tingling from the power that had surged through him moments before. The pendant around his neck felt ice-cold against his skin, its surface now cracked and dim. "What have you done?" Cassius writhed on the ground, his pale flesh smoking where the light had touched him. "The seal! The seal is broken!" Tommy's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched the vampire's wounds slowly healing. Around them, the cavern began to tremble. Dust rained from the ceiling, and somewhere in the darkness beyond, something vast and terrible stirred. "I didn't mean to," Tommy's voice cracked. "You said the town was in danger." Cassius struggled to his feet, his red eyes wild with panic. "Not from me, child. From what I've kept imprisoned for 3 centuries. He gestured frantically at the shattered remains of the crystal. That was not just any binding stone, it was the heart of shadows, the only thing keeping the devourer locked away. A low rumble shook the earth beneath their feet. The sound wasn't coming from above or around them. It was rising from somewhere far below, as if the very foundations of the world were groaning under some immense weight. "The devourer?" Tommy whispered. "A creature of pure hunger," Cassius said, already moving toward one of the tunnel openings. "It feeds on life itself, plants, animals, humans, everything. When it last walked free, it turned 100 square miles into a lifeless wasteland." He paused, looking back at Tommy with something that might have been pity. "Your ancestor, the first Guardian, helped me trap it here. We bound it with blood magic and sealed it with the crystal you just destroyed." The rumbling grew louder, and Tommy could swear he heard something else beneath it, a sound like breathing, if something the size of a mountain could breathe. Rocks began falling more heavily from the ceiling. "We have to get out of here," Cassius said. "Now." Tommy didn't argue. He ran after the vampire as they plunged into the nearest tunnel. Behind them, the cavern filled with a sound like breaking glass, but magnified 1,000-fold. The very air seemed to vibrate with malevolent energy. "How long do we have?" Tommy gasped as they ran through the narrow passage. "Minutes, maybe less." Cassius moved with inhuman speed, but he stayed close enough for Tommy to keep up. "The creature will need time to fully manifest, to remember what it is. But once it does..." They emerged into another chamber, this one smaller, but with multiple exits. Cassius paused, sniffing the air like a hunting dog. "This way," he said, choosing the leftmost tunnel. "There's a passage that leads directly to the forest's edge. We need to warn the town, get everyone to evacuate." "Evacuate?" Tommy stumbled over loose rocks as they ran. "Where can they go that this thing won't find them?" "Nowhere," Cassius admitted grimly, "but distance might buy us time to find another solution." They ran in silence for several minutes, the only sounds their footsteps and Tommy's ragged breathing. The tunnel began to slope upward, and Tommy caught the faint scent of pine needles and earth. They were getting close to the surface. "Cassius," Tommy said as they climbed. "What you said about my ancestor, what did you mean?" The vampire slowed slightly. "Your great-great-grandfather, Marcus. He was the one who first discovered the devourer when it escaped from an even older prison. Instead of fleeing like any sane person would, he sought me out. He knew the old stories, knew that sometimes monsters must be fought with monsters. But why my family? Why was I able to break the crystal?" "Guardian bloodlines carry power," Cassius explained. "It's diluted over generations, but it's still there. The pendant you wear was Marcus's. It focuses that power, makes it stronger." He glanced back at Tommy. "Though I never expected it to be strong enough to shatter the heart of shadows." They reached a fork in the tunnel, and cool night air drifted down from above. Tommy could see stars through a narrow opening. "We're almost out," Cassius said. Then he stopped so suddenly that Tommy nearly ran into him. "Wait, what is it?" The vampire's face had gone ashen. "I can't hear it anymore." "Hear what?" "The rumbling, the breaking. It's gone quiet." Cassius turned to look back the way they'd come, and Tommy saw true fear in his ancient eyes. "That means it's free." As if summoned by his words, a wave of pure darkness swept through the tunnel behind them. It wasn't the absence of light, it was something far worse. Where it touched, the very stone seemed to wither and crack. "Run!" Cassius shoved Tommy toward the surface opening. "Run and don't look back!" Tommy scrambled up the steep incline toward the stars, the vampire close behind him. But even as they climbed, he could feel something vast and hungry stirring in the depths below, something that had waited centuries for this moment of freedom. The ancient chains groaned as Morrigan tested their strength, her pale fingers wrapping around the iron links that had bound her for 3 centuries. Tommy pressed himself against the cold stone wall, watching in horror as hairline cracks appeared where her touch lingered. The metal hadn't just been forged, it had been blessed, inscribed with protective runes that now flickered weakly like dying embers. "You have no idea what you've done, child," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of countless years. 300 years I've kept the hunger at bay, and in one moment of foolish curiosity, you've undone it all." Elias stepped forward, his weathered face etched with desperate determination. "The binding isn't broken yet. I can repair it, strengthen it." Morrigan's laughter cut through his words like broken glass. "Repair it? You think your amateur magic can restore what took the combined power of 7 master warlocks to create?" Another chain link cracked audibly. "The moment the boy touched my prison, the spell began to unravel. It's only a matter of time now." Tommy's heart hammered against his ribs. "I don't understand. You're already free to move around. What's different about being completely free?" The vampire's eyes turned to him, and for a moment he saw something that looked almost like pity. "What you see before you is merely a shadow of what I truly am. These chains don't just bind my body, they bind my nature, my essence. They hold back the monster that fed on entire villages, that turned the river red with blood." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They keep me human enough to care about protecting you." The temperature in the chamber plummeted, and their breath came out in visible puffs. Frost began forming on the walls as something stirred in the depths of Morrigan's being, something ancient and ravenous that had been locked away for far too long. "How long do we have?" Elias asked, pulling a collection of strange artifacts from his coat. "Hours, maybe less." Morrigan closed her eyes, and Tommy could see her fighting some internal battle. The hunger grows stronger as the binding weakens. "Already I can smell the blood running through your veins, hear the rhythm of your hearts. Soon it will be all I can think about." Elias began arranging his artifacts in a complex pattern around the chamber. Crystals that glowed with inner fire, vials of what looked like liquid moonlight, and a knife whose blade seemed to bend light around it. There might be another way. The original binding required 7 warlocks because they were trying to preserve your consciousness while restraining your power. But if we remove the consciousness component— "You're talking about killing her," Tommy said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Not killing," Elias corrected grimly. "Putting her into a sleep so deep it's indistinguishable from death. Her body would remain, the protective curse would endure, but her mind, her awareness, her suffering, all of it would end." Morrigan opened her eyes, studying the old man's preparations. "And if your spell fails? If I wake in 50 years, or 100, completely mad from isolation, then we'll have bought time for someone else to find a permanent solution." Another chain snapped, the sound echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. Morrigan gasped, doubling over as raw power surged through her. When she straightened, her canine teeth had elongated into proper fangs, and her fingernails had grown into razor-sharp claws. "Decide quickly," she hissed through gritted teeth. "I can feel it clawing its way to the surface. The part of me that sees you as nothing more than prey." Tommy stepped closer despite every instinct screaming at him to run. There has to be another choice. What if we found a way to break the curse on the town instead? Then you wouldn't need to be bound anymore. Impossible, Elias said without looking up from his work. The curse and the town are woven together at a fundamental level. To unravel one would destroy the other. But what if— Child, Morrigan interrupted, her voice straining with effort, your heart is kind, but some chains exist for good reason. I have lived with the weight of my crimes for 3 centuries, and perhaps it's time to rest. The remaining chains creaked ominously, and cracks began spreading across their surfaces like spider webs. The air grew thick with an oppressive presence that made Tommy's skin crawl. Something vast and hungry was stirring, testing the weakening barriers that held it in check. Elias completed his circle of artifacts and began chanting in a language Tommy didn't recognize. The crystals flared to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls as power built within the chamber. But even as the spell took shape, Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that they were making a terrible mistake, that there was another answer hiding just beyond his grasp. If only he were brave enough to reach for it. The first chain shattered completely, and Morrigan screamed as ancient power flooded through her unrestrained. The ancient stone chamber trembled as Malakar's roar echoed through the underground cavern. Tommy pressed himself against the cold wall, watching in horror as the vampire lord's true form began to emerge. What had once appeared as a gaunt but recognizably human figure now twisted and elongated, his limbs stretching like shadows given substance. His face split open to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth, and his eyes burned with the fury of centuries. "You foolish child," Malakar hissed, his voice now a symphony of whispers and screams. "Do you have any idea what you've unleashed?" Tommy's hands shook as he clutched the ancient tome that had started this nightmare. The leather binding felt warm against his palms, as if something alive pulsed within its pages. Behind him, he could hear Elias struggling to break free from the stone restraints, the younger vampire's strength slowly returning as the ritual circle's power wavered. "The darkness beneath the town," Tommy stammered, remembering fragments of what he'd read in the forbidden text. "You weren't keeping it trapped, you were feeding it." Malakar's laugh was like breaking glass. "Such a clever boy. Yes, I fed it the life force of my kind, keeping it sated but never truly satisfied. A delicate balance that has protected your precious Millbrook for 300 years. But now—" The chamber floor began to crack, jagged lines spreading outward from the center of the ritual circle like a spider's web. Through the fissures, a sickly green light pulsed with increasing intensity. Tommy felt something cold and alien brush against his mind, probing for weaknesses. Elias finally broke free with a sound like shattering stone. His fangs were fully extended, and his usual controlled demeanor had vanished, replaced by desperate urgency. "Tommy, the book! You have to complete the original binding spell." "He cannot." Malakar swept toward them with inhuman speed, but his movement seemed labored, as if fighting against invisible chains. "The ritual requires a blood sacrifice of the innocent. Would you have the boy die for your noble cause, Elias?" Tommy's mind raced through the pages he had memorized. There had been another passage, written in different handwriting, a modification to the original spell. His grandmother's stories flooded back to him, tales of the town's founding that everyone assumed were just folklore. The first settlers hadn't just stumbled upon this place. They had been led here by someone who knew about the darkness below. "My ancestor," Tommy whispered, understanding flooding through him. "Sarah Whitmore. She helped create the original binding." The green light intensified, and now Tommy could hear something vast stirring far beneath them. The sound was like a heartbeat, made of grinding stone and screaming wind. Dust rained from the ceiling as the entire chamber shuddered. Elias grabbed Tommy's shoulder. "What are you talking about?" "The modification to the spell. It's in her handwriting." She left another way. Tommy opened the book with trembling fingers, flipping through pages that seemed to glow with their own inner light. "It doesn't require death. It requires choice." Malakar's form wavered between human and monster as he fought against the collapsing bonds that had held him for centuries. Impossible. I studied every word of that accursed text. But you never understood the language it was really written in. Tommy found the page he was looking for. The words seemed to shift and dance before his eyes, but somehow he could read them clearly. It's not Latin. It's older. My grandmother taught me some of it when she told her stories. She said it was the language of growing things, of life finding a way. The floor cracked wider, and now Tommy could see something moving in the depths below, a mass of writhing shadow that hurt to look at directly. The presence in his mind pressed harder, offering visions of power and knowledge beyond imagination. Elias moved to stand between Tommy and Malakar, his own vampiric nature fully manifested. Whatever you're going to do it now. Tommy pressed his palm against the open page, feeling the ancient words flow through him, like water through parched earth. The modification wasn't about binding the darkness with death. It was about offering it something better, a willing partnership instead of imprisonment, a guardian who chose the burden rather than having it forced upon them. I choose, Tommy said, his young voice somehow carrying the weight of absolute conviction. I choose to stand watch. The chamber filled with blinding light as 300 years of magical bonds suddenly shifted. Malakar screamed as his stolen power drained away, his monstrous form collapsing back into mere flesh and bone. The green glow from below softened to something almost gentle, and the alien presence in Tommy's mind settled into a watchful but no longer hostile awareness. But as the light faded, Tommy realized with growing horror that his choice had consequences he hadn't fully understood. The bond was forming, and with it came the knowledge of exactly what he had volunteered to become. The abandoned mine shaft yawned before them like the mouth of some primordial beast, its depths swallowed by a darkness so complete it seemed to devour their flashlight beams. Tommy's hands trembled as he gripped the ancient iron key Marcus had pressed into his palm, its weight far heavier than any piece of metal had a right to be. The binding chamber lies 300 feet down, Marcus whispered, his pale face etched with centuries of regret, where the first settlers thought they could contain what they'd awakened. They were wrong about containment, but right about one thing: it must never be allowed to walk freely in the world above. Sarah stepped closer to the shaft's edge, peering into the abyss. How do we know this isn't another trap? How do we know you're not just leading us to our deaths? Marcus's laugh was hollow, echoing strangely in the pre-dawn air. Child, if I wanted you dead, you would have joined the earth days ago. No, I need you alive. The ritual requires innocent blood, willingly given. Without that sacrifice, the new binding will fail. Tommy felt the blood drain from his face. Sacrifice? You didn't say anything about... Not death, Marcus interrupted quickly. But blood, yes. The ancient magic demands a price. It always has. His red eyes fixed on Tommy with an intensity that made the boy's skin crawl. 3 drops from each of you, given freely, mixed with my own essence. It's the only way to forge chains strong enough to hold what lies below. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distant sound of screaming from the town below. Through the trees, orange flames licked at the darkness where houses once stood peacefully. Whatever had broken free was growing stronger, bolder. We don't have time for this, Sarah said, shouldering her backpack. People are dying while we stand here talking. She was right, and Tommy knew it. But as he stared into that terrible darkness, every instinct screamed at him to run. His grandmother's warnings echoed in his memory. Some doors should never be opened, some paths never walked. Marcus began his descent first, his supernatural grace allowing him to navigate the rusted ladder with ease. Sarah followed, her flashlight beam dancing wildly as she climbed down. Tommy took a shaking breath and swung his legs over the edge. The metal rungs were slick with moisture and age, some so corroded they crumbled at his touch. 20 feet down, 30, 50, the circle of starlight above grew smaller with each step until it was nothing more than a pinprick in an ocean of black. Stay close. Marcus's voice drifted up from below. The tunnels branch in many directions. Most lead to cave-ins or worse. The air grew thick and oppressive as they descended, carrying scents of earth and decay and something else, something ancient and wrong that made Tommy's nose burn. Strange symbols had been carved into the rock walls, their meaning lost to time, but their malevolent intent clear enough. At the bottom, they found themselves in a narrow tunnel barely wide enough for two people to walk abreast. Water dripped steadily from somewhere in the darkness, each drop echoing like a funeral bell. Marcus led them deeper, past collapsed passages and chambers that had been sealed with iron bars and blessed silver. The townspeople tried to contain other things down here, he explained, as they passed a cell where something had clawed deep gouges into the stone walls. Creatures that wandered in from the deep places, drawn by the same power that holds the devourer. Most starved eventually. Some didn't. Tommy tried not to think about what might still be lurking in those sealed chambers as they walked. The tunnel began to slope downward more sharply, and the air grew colder with each step. His breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began to form on the walls despite the late summer weather above. "We're close," Marcus murmured. And indeed Tommy could feel something ahead, a presence that made his skin crawl and his teeth ache. The binding chamber was built at the convergence of three ley lines. The power here is substantial. They rounded a final corner and emerged into a vast circular chamber carved from living rock. Ancient symbols covered every surface, their lines filled with what looked like dried blood and silver. At the center sat a massive stone altar, its surface stained black with centuries of ritual use. But it was what lay beyond the altar that stole Tommy's breath entirely. Chains of black iron stretched from floor to ceiling, each link as thick as Tommy's arm and covered in symbols that seemed to writhe in their flashlight beams. And wrapped within those chains, pressed against the far wall, was a shadow in the rough shape of a man, but wrong in every way that mattered. The devourer, even bound, even weakened, its presence filled the chamber with a hunger so vast and terrible that Tommy's knees nearly buckled. The shadow's head turned toward them, and when it spoke, the voice came from everywhere at once. "Welcome, little guardian. I've been waiting for you to come home." The ancient oak's roots writhed beneath Tommy's feet as Silas pressed his palm against the bark, his face contorting with centuries of accumulated pain. The tree pulsed with malevolent energy, and Tommy could feel the curse fighting back, tendrils of darkness lashing out like angry serpents. "It's not working," Tommy gasped, watching as Silas stumbled backward, smoke rising from his burned palm. "The curse is too strong." Blood trickled from the vampire's mouth, his usual composure cracking. "The binding has grown deeper roots than I anticipated. It feeds on the fear and suffering of generations." A bone-chilling howl echoed through the forest, followed by another, then another. The shadowlings were massing, drawn by the disturbance. Tommy's heart hammered against his ribs as red eyes began appearing between the trees, circling them like hungry wolves. "We need more power," Silas said, his voice barely a whisper. "The ritual requires a willing sacrifice, but not of life, of innocence itself." Tommy's stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" "You would have to choose, child. Remain as you are and watch your town fall to eternal darkness, or surrender your childhood, your pure heart, to fuel the breaking of these chains. You would survive, but you would never again see the world through untainted eyes." The shadowlings crept closer, their forms shifting and writhing like living nightmares. Tommy could hear their whispers now, promises of power, threats of pain, pleas for release. His hands shook as he reached toward the oak again. "There has to be another way," he said desperately. "You've been fighting this for centuries. You must know something else." Silas's expression softened with something that might have been paternal affection. "I have tried everything, Tommy. Blood magic, ancient rites, bargains with entities far darker than myself. This curse was crafted by masters of the art, woven with threads that only innocence can unravel." A shadowling broke from the circle, lunging toward them with claws extended. Silas moved with inhuman speed, his own claws tearing through the creature's smoky form. It dissolved with a shriek, but two more took its place. "Decide quickly," Silas urged, parrying another attack. "Dawn is still hours away, and I cannot hold them all back." Tommy closed his eyes, thinking of his mother's worried face, of Sheriff Morrison's kind eyes, of Mrs. Henderson's warm cookies. He thought of Sarah probably lying awake, wondering if he was safe, and of all the other children in Millbrook, who deserved to grow up without shadows hunting them. When he opened his eyes, his resolve had crystallized. "Tell me what I have to do." "Place both hands on the oak's heart," Silas instructed while slashing at another shadowling. "Speak your true name and offer your innocence freely to break the binding. But Tommy, once this is done, you cannot undo it. You will see the darkness that exists in all things. You will understand cruelty and betrayal as if you had lived them. The world will never again hold wonder without shadow." Tommy stepped forward, the shadowlings hissing and recoiling from his presence. Even corrupted as they were, something in them recognized the power of pure intent. His small hands trembled as he placed them against the rough bark. The oak's heartwood thrummed beneath his palms, ancient and diseased. He could feel the curse like a living thing, wrapped around the tree's core in thorny coils. It was hungry, desperate, and utterly malevolent. "My name is Thomas Mitchell Brennan," he said clearly, his voice carrying despite the chaos around them. "I offer my innocence freely to break these chains." The tree exploded with light, not the clean brightness of dawn, but a searing, painful radiance that made Tommy's bones ache. Power flowed through him and out of him simultaneously, and he felt something precious being torn away, leaving raw emptiness in its wake. The curse fought back with vicious intensity. Tommy screamed as visions flooded his mind. Centuries of cruelty, betrayal, violence, and despair. He saw the true nature of humanity's capacity for evil, felt the weight of every dark thought and selfish act committed in Millbrook's shadow. The knowledge burned through him like acid, stripping away layers of childish faith and wonder. But beneath his hands, the oak was changing. The diseased bark began to crack and fall away, revealing healthy wood underneath. The curse's grip loosened, its howls of rage echoing through dimensions Tommy hadn't known existed. Silas appeared beside him, adding his own strength to the ritual. Together, vampire and child pulled at the curse's bindings, unraveling centuries of careful work. The shadowlings dissolved one by one, their screams fading into whispers, then silence. With a final thunderous crack, the ancient oak split down the middle. Dark ichor poured from the wound, steaming and writhing as it touched the forest floor. The malevolent presence that had haunted Blackwood Forest for so long gave one last furious shriek before vanishing entirely. Tommy collapsed, no longer the same boy who had followed a blood trail into these woods. The ancient chains groaned as they pulled taut, their iron links glowing with an ethereal light that cut through the supernatural darkness engulfing Millbrook. Tommy could feel the weight of every decision, every choice that had led him to this moment where he stood between two impossible futures. Cassius writhed against his restored bonds, his aristocratic facade cracking to reveal something far older and more terrible beneath. "You foolish child," he snarled, his voice echoing with centuries of rage. "You have doomed them all. The hunger comes, and without me to stand guard, it will devour everything you hold dear." But even as the vampire spoke, Tommy could see the truth in his eyes, the relief, the desperate gratitude of a creature who had carried an unbearable burden for far too long. The chains weren't just binding Cassius, they were freeing him from a responsibility that had slowly driven him mad over the centuries. The ground beneath them shuddered, and cracks began spreading outward from the ancient seal. Through the fissures came something that made Tommy's young mind recoil in horror. It wasn't darkness exactly, but rather the absence of everything good and warm in the world. The hunger was rising, and it was nothing like the civilized monster that Cassius had become. "The ritual," Tommy whispered, remembering the words carved into the stone circle. "There has to be another way." Mrs. Henderson appeared at his side. her weathered face grim but determined. In her hands, she clutched an old leather journal, the same one Tommy had seen her reading in secret all those nights when he thought she was just doing crossword puzzles. "There is," she said quietly, "but the price is still blood, Tommy. It always has been." The journal fell open to pages covered in her grandfather's careful handwriting. The true history of Millbrook, written by one of the original settlers who had helped forge the chains that bound not one monster, but two. Cassius had been the guardian, yes, but he had also been the offering, a vampire's immortal life force channeled through the chains to keep the hunger contained. The town's founders didn't just stumble upon Cassius, Mrs. Henderson explained as the darkness pressed closer around them. They made a deal with him, his freedom and humanity in exchange for eternal service. But the magic was flawed from the beginning. Every year he remained bound, he lost more of himself to the very thing he was meant to guard against. Tommy understood now why Cassius had seemed so desperate to be free, yet so terrified of what would happen if he escaped. The vampire had been fighting a war on two fronts, against the hunger trying to break free and against his own gradual transformation into something just as monstrous. "But we can do it differently," Mrs. Henderson continued, kneeling beside Tommy as the ground cracked wider. "The chains don't need a monster to power them. They need someone willing to sacrifice for others, someone pure of heart." The implication hit Tommy like a physical blow. "You mean me?" "Not to guard it forever like Cassius did," she said quickly. "Just long enough to forge new chains, stronger ones, chains that will hold without corrupting the guardian." The darkness surged upward through the cracks, and Tommy caught a glimpse of something vast and writhing beneath the earth, eyes like dying stars and teeth that weren't quite teeth. The hunger had been contained so long that it had evolved into something beyond vampire, beyond any natural predator. It was appetite given form, need without conscience or mercy. Cassius's chains flared brighter as he threw his remaining strength into holding the barrier. "Decide quickly, boy," he gasped. "I cannot maintain this much longer." Tommy looked back toward town, where lights flickered in windows and families sat down to dinner, completely unaware of the cosmic horror stirring beneath their feet. His mother would be setting a place for him, probably wondering why he was late. Sarah would be practicing piano. Mr. Peterson would be walking his dog. All of it so normal, so precious, so worth protecting. Tommy stepped forward and placed his small hand on the central chain. Immediately, he felt the connection, the vast network of protective magic that had kept Millbrook safe for generations. But he also felt something else, the presence of every guardian who had come before, their strength flowing through the metal links. "You don't have to do this alone," Mrs. Henderson said, placing her weathered hand over his. "The whole town will share the burden. That's how it should have been from the beginning." The chain grew warm under their touch, and Tommy felt the magic shift and change. Not the desperate, corrupting power that had slowly destroyed Cassius, but something cleaner. Something that drew strength from connection rather than sacrifice. The hunger roared its frustration as new bindings began to form, silver bright and unbreakable. But Tommy barely heard it. He was too busy feeling the weight of his community settling around his shoulders like a warm blanket, not crushing but supporting. The ground beneath Tommy's feet trembled as the ancient seal cracked wider, sending spider webs of golden light racing across the forest floor. Elias collapsed against the obsidian altar, his pale face twisted in agony as centuries of borrowed power drained from his body like water through a broken dam. "You don't understand what you've done," Elias gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "The things that sleep beneath, they've been waiting so long." Tommy clutched the silver pendant his grandmother had given him, its surface now burning hot against his palm. The blood trail that had first led him into these cursed woods seemed to pulse with renewed life, flowing backward toward the widening fissure in the earth. "I had to," Tommy said, his 8-year-old voice steadier than he felt. "You were killing people. Mrs. Henderson, the mailman, my friend Sarah's dad. I saw what you did to them." A bitter laugh escaped Elias's lips. "Killing?" Child, I was feeding, just enough to maintain the barriers to keep the seals strong. A life here and there to save thousands. His eyes, no longer the predatory gold Tommy remembered, had faded to a dull amber. But you've chosen to break the chain. Now watch as your noble gesture damns us all. The crack in the seal stretched wider, and something dark and viscous began seeping through the gap. Where it touched the forest floor, the very earth withered and died. Ancient trees that had stood for centuries groaned and toppled as their roots rotted in seconds. Tommy stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. There has to be another way. You could have told someone, asked for help instead of just taking people. Who would have believed? Elias struggled to his feet, his form already becoming translucent. A vampire's tale of elder things that predate humanity? Of tentacled horrors that dream of consuming reality itself? He gestured weakly toward the spreading corruption. I was young once too. Before I took on this burden, I thought there were always better solutions, kinder paths. The pendant in Tommy's hand grew so hot he almost dropped it. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, words she'd spoken just last week that he hadn't understood then. Sometimes the right choice isn't the good choice, Tommy. Sometimes you have to carry darkness to protect the light. She knew, Tommy breathed. Grandma knew about you, about all of this. Elias nodded weakly. Your bloodline has guarded secrets for generations. Why do you think you could see the blood trail when others couldn't? Why your touch could break seals that have held for centuries? His form flickered like a candle in the wind. She was supposed to explain when you came of age, prepare you for what might come. A sound like breaking glass mixed with screaming wind erupted from the widening fissure. Something vast and impossible pressed against the weakening barrier, and Tommy caught a glimpse of eyes like dying stars and flesh that hurt to perceive directly. What do I do? Tommy's voice cracked with fear and desperation. How do I fix this? Elias's fading form reached toward him, ghostly fingers barely visible in the golden light of the failing seal. The pendant. It's not just silver. It contains a fragment of the original binding, passed down through your family for safekeeping. His voice grew fainter with each word. But the cost? Tell me. To forge a new seal, it requires a willing guardian. Someone to take my place, to become what I became. Elias's eyes met Tommy's, and for the first time the vampire looked truly ancient and infinitely tired. But you're just a child. The transformation alone would... Tommy didn't let him finish. He pressed the pendant against the largest crack in the seal, feeling its heat merge with the golden light. I'm not strong enough to be a guardian, but maybe I don't have to be. Instead of trying to bind himself to the seal as Elias had centuries ago, Tommy pushed his own life force into the pendant itself, not as a permanent sacrifice, but as a bridge. The silver artifact began to glow with the same golden light as the seal, and Tommy felt his grandmother's presence, and her grandmother's, and countless generations stretching back through time. The burden doesn't have to fall on one person, he realized aloud. It can be shared, passed between us when one grows too weak. The pendant exploded with brilliant light, and Tommy felt the seal slam shut with such force that it knocked him to his knees. The corruption retreated, the withered trees slowly regaining their life, and the terrible sounds from beneath faded to silence. When the light finally dimmed, Elias was gone, but his voice lingered on the wind like a whispered blessing. Well done, young guardian. Tommy looked down at the pendant, now permanently fused to his palm with veins of silver threading up his arm. He could feel the seal's strength and his own responsibility to it, but he could also feel the warmth of those who would come after him, ready to share the burden when his time came. The walk home seemed shorter somehow, and when he emerged from Blackwood Forest, the morning sun felt warmer than it had in years.